Welcome. Welcome to St. Jerome's University and welcome to the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience. I would like to start us off this evening with a little exercise in building community, and that is that there are some empty seats here, there, and everywhere in the middle. I wonder if people would stand up and move towards, fill those seats in the middle so that there are empty seats on the rows for latecomers, if people could do that for a second. All right. You didn't have permission to start talking. You just had permission to move. Okay, thank you very much for your cooperation. Tonight, at the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience, we have a very special guest with us, Roy Romanow. In case you don't know, this is part of our lecture series that the St. Jerome's Centre produces every year. This year, the lecture series is called Christians Without Borders. In case you don't know what the St. Jerome's Centre is, I want to read to you from a review of a book produced recently by Novalis St. Paul's Press called The Hidden Pierre Elliott Trudeau, The Faith Behind the Politics. And this review was written by Stephen Sharper in the Toronto Star. And the book, The Hidden Trudeau, was co-edited by the Chancellor of St. Jerome's University, Richard Gwynne. And Stephen Sharper is talking about Trudeau's interesting relationship between his politics and his faith. And he writes, was this man a religious schizophrenic, a religious secularist, a secular religionist, a political dictator, or a Catholic-tinged authoritarian interested solely in order and good government? Or was he rather a very well-educated liberal who kept his personal faith out of the political boredoms of the nation and miles away from Parliament Hill? And this is the part you should pay attention to. These and other questions are posed and probed in this lively and overall engaging collection from the fertile campus of St. Jerome's University under President Michael Higgins's dynamic leadership. Michael couldn't be here. He's in Poland. That's how dynamic he is. Michael Higgins' dynamic leadership, whose illuminating essay introduces the volume. St. Jerome's, I love this part, St. Jerome's has become a leading center of Catholic thought in Canada. This is in the Toronto Star, no doubt, where they have some other Catholic college there. All right, now this one I love. The vortex, I love this word vortex, of such a vital swirl is the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience. That's us. Now there's some very nice comments about myself that modesty prevents me from reading. Now this is the season of Lent, a time of repentance, and I think we should start with a prayer asking the Lord to forgive Stephen Sharper for these gross exaggerations and to forgive Michael Higgins and myself for enjoying them so very, very much. So in case you're wondering, if your head is spinning any time tonight, it's not old age or boredom, it's because you are in a vortex. So, tonight we have both a lecture and a celebration. The John Sweeney Lecture in Current Issues in Healthcare is a celebration of the life of John Sweeney and the contribution he made to St. Mary's Hospital, the St. Joseph Healthcare System, and St. Jerome's University. It is also a celebration of the common Catholic heritage that those three public institutions have in common and the project of a more fully human society that they pursue. And finally, it is a celebration of the meeting place between Catholic values and Canadian values, the affirmation of life that is found in the best of the church, the hospital, the university, and the broader Canadian society. While grounded in the Roman Catholic tradition, the St. Jerome Centre is intentionally ecumenical. It welcomes people of goodwill from all faith perspectives and from those who espouse none. But to welcome you to St. Jerome's, I now call upon Dr. Kieran Bonner, our academic dean and vice president.
Thank you, David. You didn't mention one of those other things you probably got some pleasure out of reading, which was a recent survey in the imprint where they asked students various things, but one of the things they asked, who is the person you would most like to be a sex slave to at the university? And David Suljac's name came up number one on the university on the University of Waterloo campus. I've heard that he teaches a course on evil. I haven't audited that course, but I'm now starting to wonder if I should, as Dean, audit that course. I would like to welcome you here on behalf of the President, who much regrets that he can't be here, to St. Jerome's and to this wonderful lecture that we're about to hear from Mr. Roy Romanow. We're very proud here of our contribution to public debate, as David has already mentioned. Since I've been here, we've had Claude Ryan here speaking on faith and public life. We've had Joe Clark, Preston Manning, and now Roy Romanow. So I think of the Conservative Party, the Reform Party, the Liberal Party, and now the NDP. It shows you how politically ecumenical we are. We're proud, particularly in this issue, or in this debate, highlighted today with the front story in the front page of the Globe and Mail about the Pope and the Vatican claiming the difficulty of expectations and utopian expectations with regard to healthcare, and the Pope as a model of frailty and pain going into old age, and the issues that has, the comments by various experts on healthcare with regard to that. It did remind me of an anecdote. Of course, I have a microphone, so every Irishman has an anecdote. And it's about somebody who went back home to Ireland for a funeral of his uncle, and he was talking to his cousin. He says, so what did he die of? Was it cancer? No. Was it heart attack? No. What did he die of? I don't remember, but it wasn't anything serious. So, of course, in all of these situations, we do have to make a life between birth and death. Again, I'm very proud to welcome all of you to this debate. Proud to welcome Mr. Roy Romanow, and in terms of the distinguished contributions he has made to Canadian public life and to the healthcare debate. I want to welcome the members of the St. Mary's General Hospital community, especially Vivian Zakowski, Chair of the St. Mary's General Hospital Board, and Marion Bramwell, the hospital's Chief Operating Officer. Welcome. The generous donors to the St. Mary's General Hospital Foundation. We're all seated up front here. Members of the Ecumenical Healthcare Network of the Canadian Council of Churches, and members of the Sweeney family, especially Kay Sweeney, whose husband this lecture is named after. You have a couple of more introductions, so I'm going to be brief and now introduce Andre Anderson, the President of St. Mary's General Hospital Foundation, who will say a few words about the Sweeney lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Bonner, and good evening. It's a great pleasure for me to add my own word of welcome to the third annual John Sweeney Lecture on behalf of all of us associated with St. Mary's General Hospital. This is an important event in the life of our hospital when we honor an individual whose commitment to public life is legendary and whose commitment to St. Mary's was equally well known. The annual John Sweeney Lecture in Current Issues in Healthcare was initiated by St. Mary's General Hospital to honor the memory of John Sweeney, a distinguished educator and public servant who died in July 2001. Among his many contributions to public life and to his community and church, John served on the Board of Trustees of St. Mary's for 10 years, and the hospital benefited immensely from his wisdom and commitment. John was also known to be an intellectually engaged and inquiring Catholic thinker. It seemed a most appropriate tribute to establish the lecture in his name. St. Mary's General Hospital and the Sisters of St. Joseph of Hamilton jointly fund this lecture. We are grateful for this opportunity to remember and to honor an individual who touched our organization so profoundly. If you would like to help us carry on this lecture, you will find donor cards on your seats supporting the Sweeney Endowment. You can leave them at the St. Mary's table at the back on your way out if you'd like. I would like to take a moment to recognize Kay Sweeney and members of her family who are here with us tonight to mark this special occasion. Kay and the family. Tonight's topic is one that would have interested John very much. I know he held Mr. Romanow in the highest regard, and although he did not live to see his report, those of you who knew John would agree with me that he would have supported its basic notion of inclusiveness and fairness to all. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. This year's Sweeney Lecture is Roy Romanow. Roy Romanow was born in Tommy Douglas's Saskatchewan. Tommy Douglas, as you know, is the father of Canadian Medicare, and in 2004 was voted number 1 in CBC's Greatest Canadian competition. And it seems that Mr. Romanow is still determined that Canadians associate compassionate, just, and universal health care with that province, and not just corner gas. Which is a very good show, by the way. Mr. Romanow was raised and educated in Saskatoon and graduated from the University of Saskatchewan, where he earned his arts and law degrees. He was first elected to the Saskatchewan legislature in 1967, and between 1971 and 82, Mr. Romanow served as the Deputy Premier of Saskatchewan. Throughout those years, he also served as Saskatchewan's Attorney General and was responsible for, among other things, the creation of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and the introduction of a Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. In 1979, Mr. Romanow was appointed Saskatchewan's Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and he was one of the key players in the federal-provincial negotiations that resulted in the Constitutional Accord and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. A decade later, he was also a participant in the Charlottetown Accord negotiations. In 1991, Mr. Romanow became the Premier of Saskatchewan, a post he held until he retired from active political life in 2001. Among other achievements, too numerous to mention here, of course, Mr. Romanow's government undertook large-scale reforms to the healthcare system based on the premise of wellness and prevention. Retirement in 2001 did not mean inactivity or disengagement for Mr. Romanow. On April 4th, 2001, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien appointed him to head the Royal Commission on the Future of Healthcare in Canada. The Commission's mandate was to recommend policies and measures to ensure the long-term stability of a universally accessible, high-quality, publicly administered healthcare system for all Canadians. The Commission's final report, Building on Values, was released in 2002. Currently, Mr. Romanow holds the position of Senior Fellow in Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina, and Visiting Fellow in the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University. In 2003, Mr. Romanow received the Economic Justice Award from the Atkinson Charitable Foundation of Toronto. He was also awarded honorary doctorates from the University of Ottawa and Brock University. Mr. Romanow entitled tonight's talk, Healthcare and Canadian Values. To explain that title, I would like to quote from the acceptance speech Mr. Romanow gave when he received the prestigious Administration Award from the Pan American Health Organization for his work on the Health Commission. He received this award in Washington in 2003, and Mr. Romanow said in his acceptance speech, "The first lesson is that values matter. Initiatives and policies inconsistent with the values of those they are intended to benefit that do not resonate with citizens will ultimately fail. And make no mistake, the choices we make in relation to healthcare or to primary care are ultimately choices between competing values. And to help us make wise choices, I now call on Mr. Roy Romanow."
Thank you very much, Dr. Seljak, distinguished ladies and gentlemen and friends. I want to begin by saying that after the comments respecting the Trudeau Conference on Spirituality in the book, which resulted in all of the glowing reviews for St. Jerome's, it's going to be awfully difficult for me to go back to Saskatchewan to tell St. Thomas More College that I was part of a vortex out at Kitchener-Waterloo area. But somehow I hope to survive that explanation challenge. I also want to say that I'm kind of feeling like the time that I did when I first entered politics back out in, 1967, as David pointed out. I was speaking in rural Saskatchewan, a place called Lumsden, just outside of Regina. This is an absolutely true story. And I'm reminded of this because of all of the previous speakers who spoke so eloquently. The chair got up. He was a farmer. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a wonderful meal." In those days, we weren't politically correct. Thanks to the ladies of Lumsden constituency. Today, it's ladies and men, and you know how much the men still help out today, right? So, wonderful meal. Good entertainment, thanks to you, Charlie, and the good old-time country fiddle. He says, when you get to fiddling, you're the best around these parts. Good food and good music. Now that all the good things are over, here's our guest speaker, Roy Romanow. So I'm hoping that the question and answer period will really be the good part of the address. Well, let me begin by saying that I'm very delighted and honored to be at St. Jerome's University to give this year's John Sweeney Lecture. St. Jerome's, and I firmly believe this, having read much about the university and the visit here, is in the true spirit of university, welcoming people of all faiths and encourages faculty, students, and citizens to reach out to others to promote social justice in the community. And today we're here to honor the late John Sweeney, who, as you know, was the first late chancellor, I believe that's the case, of St. Jerome's. He also was one of Waterloo Region's most respected citizens. Indeed, I would argue one of Canada's finest people. So I'm truly privileged to have been invited to share a few thoughts on the occasion of this annual Sweeney Lecture. Now, I did not have the pleasure of personally meeting Mr. Sweeney, but from all I know and all I've heard, he entered politics quite obviously to make a real difference. And thus he's remembered as a man of remarkable integrity, great social conscience, and a passion in public life. I might also say that he maybe showed a bit of passion in his private life as he and Kay raised 10 children together. But the portrait of the man is that of one who's committed to community and to improving the quality of life. And in consequence, his community gave back to him the privilege, and believe me, it's a privilege, of representing the riding from 1975 to 1990, I believe, if my numbers are right. And from the stories told to me by mutual friends, he left behind an unmatched legacy of caring and commitment. John Sweeney was a devout Roman Catholic, and his religious beliefs and values focused, perhaps some might argue, more on social issues rather than economic ones. Although his leadership in the mid-'80s on social assistance reform in Ontario brought social and economic concerns together. His unwavering belief that we need to look out for our fellow citizens, doing what's right for each other rather than just what is expedient, is still remembered. I know this because I heard it even last night in the corridors of Queen's Park. And his leadership as Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, as Minister of Community and Social Services, was consistently guided by his desire to help those who are disadvantaged through no fault of their own. One might say, when one looks back at all of this history, and it's a very quick sketch, John's values were not just specifically Catholic values or Christian values alone, but the very values that are shared by the overwhelming majority of Canadians. And with the world filled today with uncertainty, delivered by natural disasters and driven by them, and man-made conflicts, focusing on the values that we all have in common, regardless of our religious differences, is more important than ever, I would argue. And it is that legacy that John Sweeney has given to us. Values. And that's what Medicare is based on. The report is titled, Building on Values. Fairness, equity, compassion, and solidarity. One important Canadian health policy expert recently wrote that Medicare in Canada was, in his words, quote, designed to express civic solidarity and compassion, end quote. I believe that. And building on these values, Canadians view their healthcare system as a truly national program. I want to underline the word national. Yes, delivered locally, but structured on intergovernmental collaboration and cooperation, not warfare, and based on a mutual understanding of those Canadian values. Canadians want and expect their governments to ensure that the policies and programs that define Medicare remain true to what they believe. I know this. Some might say, how do I know this? Well, I never had an experience before like the experience of 18 months being health commissioner. One of the most challenging and rewarding periods of more than 3 decades in public life. We engaged tens of thousands of Canadians in a dialogue about the future of health care and Medicare. They spoke passionately, eloquently, thoughtfully about their desire to sustain Medicare and to transform it for the future, to make it even a more truly national program, more comprehensive, more responsive, more accountable. I traveled to other countries to examine international best practices, met with experts, and I would argue, although I'm biased, commissioned what I believe is the most thorough and most recent research in the field of healthcare reform. In fact, there are 3 volumes published as backup to the report itself. 44 research papers were commissioned, 3 of which were major consortium reports. We made arrangements for every proceeding to be broadcast to the Canadian public, and all of these studies were released before I made the recommendations in the final report, for a reason. Release them before so that we could be informed by a public that might have an opposing point of view, to stimulate contrary views based on evidence, if such evidence existed. On top of it, panels of experts were hosted internationally. We were, for example, hosted by an independent European research agency, OECD, studying, for example, the question of user pay, the European example. I traveled there and took part in that conference. Another one was the experience of OECD countries on public-private partnerships. What kind of role should the private play in the public system? And so on. And so when people say today, as some do in this current debate, but what about the fact that Sweden or France or the UK or Germany allow, say, for a more robust private-for-profit delivery role, or pay-as-you-go or user fees? I can say with confidence that we did examine that evidence, not selectively to make a point, not objectively but comprehensively, to get a real insight, a real truthful insight into what really works and does not work overall. Suffice it to say, the report enabled me, in the consequence of all of this reaching out and study, to separate myth from reality, ideology from evidence, and knee-jerk reactions from long-term solutions. But I said a few moments ago that Medicare truly reflects Canadian values. And what made the Commission a particularly meaningful experience, having heard from tens of thousands of Canadians? By the way, we had over 750,000 individual visitors to the Commission website, some 38 million hits in total. And having examined the evidence, what really made this Commission a particularly meaningful experience was the affirmation of our strongly held belief that values and principles underlying the concept of Medicare are as sound today as they were when we established it as Canadians 45 years ago. Reform is needed, to be sure, but Medicare remains one of the single greatest symbols of our uniqueness as Canadians. Why? Because Canadians realize that illness and injury know no boundaries. They afflict us all, whether we're rich or poor, regardless of our gender or our background. We are born and given life, and we live and we contribute to our society, and we will get ill, and we will experience the last act of living. We shall die. There are no borders or boundaries to that, and individual Canadians realize it. They need to be assured that Medicare will be available to them if and when they need it. And I agree with somebody who said this earlier. If Medicare hadn't been key to what it means to be a Canadian before John Sweeney's time in government, from what I know of him, he would have worked hard to invent it. He would not have wanted the poor to get sick, worrying about getting sick. And so, having amassed all of this evidence, in my report, the very first proposal, recommendation, was that we draft and accept a Canadian Health Covenant. A Canadian Health Covenant, note the word covenant, as a common declaration of Canadians and government's commitment and the caregivers to a universally accessible, publicly funded healthcare system to restore our faith in the Canadian Medicare plan. The covenant's objectives, by the way, I actually drafted it out in the report, would be to clearly state the objectives of the healthcare system for the public, for the patients, and for the healthcare providers, to inform and educate and support better decision-making, and to serve as a common foundation for collaboration among governments, public and caregivers and managers. Ultimately, the real purpose of the covenant would be to stand as a clear statement of, by, and to Canadians, in essence, a new mission statement for our healthcare system. a public acknowledgement that life, with all of its vagaries, its peaks and its valleys, is precious and binds us together, as I've spoken. I got this idea from the Ecumenical Council. They made the presentation in May 2002, and it struck me as being a concept which spoke to spirituality and to the notion of the common journey in life that we are all going through, that it would be a good symbol to restore faith, as I've described, that it became the number one first recommendation. Because Medicare is quintessential as a Canadian program, it is so because it's a convergence point where our values, some might say even our spirituality, come together. It underscores our belief that citizenship confers upon us certain rights but responsibilities, which are based on the strength of our need and not on the size of our wallet. Friends, when I reflect upon all that I heard, I'm also left with a clear sense that it was not just health, care, or values that people were talking about when they came to the meetings or emailed us or wrote or called, but it was also about the health of our political institutions and of our democracy. I believe that a large number of Canadians saw our consultations as an opportunity to participate directly in the democratic process. They felt that their contributions could make a difference, that for once they were not powerless, that the possible demise of a program to which they were profoundly attached and which appeared under threat was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. I still believe that this sentiment strongly exists today as the debate still continues amongst our citizens. So clearly, as you can see, values underpin any society, and ours especially. And in the specific case of Medicare, values underpin Medicare. But in order now to accurately describe the present situation of healthcare and the debate, I must provide a brief, I hope, but relatively simple and understandable description of Medicare, because many myths still permeate this debate. Let me try to deal with some of these myths. First, there is a misconception or a myth in some quarters that Canada has one big, large public healthcare system, an overly expensive and unwieldy giant, unable to keep up with the demands of today and utterly unfit for tomorrow. One big monolithic system. Well, the actual fact is that we do not have one truly national system, let alone a monolithic one. No, instead we have what could be argued as 14 different public healthcare systems. One for each province, one for each of the 3 territories, and one for the federal government, which is a funder, a regulator, and a provider, 6th largest in Canada. They are all bound, however, by the shared principles enunciated by the Canada Health Act. I'm going to refer to that as a CHA from here on in. Canada Health Act passed in 1984. And in that Canada Health Act, they're bound by the core of the healthcare services that are set out therein. That CHA legislation states that all of us as Canadian citizens are entitled to a core of, quote, medically necessary services, end quote. Note that phrase. It's undefined, but in the context of the Vatican statement today, as alluded to and reported, medically necessary services, not services which are designed to keep us young forever or to make sure that we continue to look as young as we were at birth or at whatever stage. No, medically necessary services, but delivered by doctors and hospitals and paid from the public purse of all of us on our ability to pay. The more we make, the more we pay. The less we make, the less we pay. I argue a reflection of the community acting in pursuit of the public good. That's a CHA core. As well, the Act, as you know, outlines the 5 pillars of values or principles of Medicare. It must be universally acceptable, this core, comprehensive, portable between the provinces, delivered without direct charge extra to the patients because you pay through the tax bill, and publicly administered. And the federal government, as you know, can enforce the CHA by withholding from provinces that don't follow it, withholding cash transfer payments that Ottawa might make to the provinces for healthcare service, although sadly, I might say, this has been only done rarely in recent times. So in actual practice, each jurisdiction has autonomy, significant latitude to administer and deliver Medicare services in whatever way it sees fit and appropriate for its region. Outside of Medicare, the core CHA basket of services, provinces can and do, in varying degrees, fund and subsidize and deliver extra health care, such as prescription drug plans, home care, long-term care, community care services. That's all outside the CHA. And as we know, most hospitals, or many of them, are private but not for profit, like St. Mary's or St. Paul's in Saskatoon, where I was born. And regional authorities have an arm's length approach with provincial governments. And all the doctors, as we know, are independent contractors. So out of all of this, we can conclude that we are miles removed from the notion of a single, monolithic, uniform public monopoly. It's just not true. A myth is a second myth. Nor is the whole system publicly paid for. In fact, it's a very complex structure with three main categories of financing. Bear with me on this. I'll be very brief, or as brief as I can. But it's very important to understand the financing to lead to the next argument that I make. Three main categories of financing for our Medicare. The first, or the core level that I've described in the CHA, the medically necessary services limited to doctors and hospitals, I repeat, this is the core of the Medicare plan. That's basically what we call Medicare. This core level of services is where we pay indirectly through progressive taxation. These services, paid for by public funds wholly, add up to 42 cents a year of the total, namely outside of the core, the total package of healthcare dollars spent in healthcare. By the way, over the last 20 years, it's changed remarkably little, from about 40 to 42 cents. That's level one. Imagine a core. And then around the core, there's a second level, worth about 25, 26 cents of our total healthcare bill. This can be described as a blend of public and private spending, some private, some public-private partnerships. What are kind of the examples I'm referring to outside of the core? Drug costs are outside of the core and a prime example. Most provinces cover some form of prescription medications out of their general revenues, but in many provinces, only for certain groups, such as seniors and low-income individuals. Thus, when it comes to drug payments, individuals generally contribute co-payments out of their pocket, or they turn to private insurance, or they have company insurance plans to help defray the costs of medications, or they simply pay cash on the dash. Home care, rehabilitation, continuing care, long-term care. All of these are in the second core, and they're outside of the CHA. As I say, the CHA covers none of this second tier of blended services, except as they relate directly to doctors and hospitals. Then finally, there's a third ring, the core, the second ring blended, now the third ring, and that is exclusively private. 30 cents out of every total healthcare dollar is spent on private fund for healthcare delivery. What is included in this category? Obviously, dental care, vision care, as well as services provided by psychologists, chiros, physios, osteos, naturopaths, and the like. Some are basically not covered by the Canada's public plans. Individuals have work-based insurance programs. They're covered, but that's private. Others pay directly, as I say, out of their own pockets, cash on the dash. So to summarize, at the core, 42 cents, that's the public. 25 or thereabouts is the mixed public-private, and 30, just slightly over, is private out-of-pocket exclusively. So you can see it's not totally funded. It's a complex funding system. And keeping these three levels in mind, I now would like to briefly examine the financial data to determine where the pressure points for increased funding really exist, which is what the current debate is about. It's not sustainable. This is necessary because of those people who argue that the public system is not sustainable, as I've said. And therefore, we should move to more private for-profit delivery and private for-profit payment. So let's look at the data. In looking at these funding arrangements, let's first acknowledge something which is paramount. The overriding consideration for healthcare costs should be the total costs. The total costs. After all, our citizens pay the total bill for health care, whether we pay for it out of our right pocket for private pay, or whether we pay for it out of our left pocket through our taxation system or cash on the counters I've described. Stated another way, pushing some of these costs out of the government budgets and directly into the budgets of individuals may save the governments more money, but can end up costing more to society and more to individuals, particularly those individuals least able to afford this shifting of costs. This kind of cost shifting is false economy. And there has been shifting which is taking place. How did this occur? Well, in the 1990s, we saw two things happen. First, Ottawa introduced in 1995 the CHST, Canada Health Social Transfer. They blended the health transfer and the social transfer into one lump sum, and then transferred to the provinces in that one lump sum, reduced figures. So the provinces got less money from Ottawa. And a second thing happened. In the 1990s, the federal provincial governments were faced with a huge public debt problem. I was in my own province. and there was a concerted effort to try to rein in expenditures, and at a provincial level, the first target to rein in the expenditures are at the healthcare level. But it was a double whammy. Less money from Ottawa, less money from the provinces. 10 years this took place. What was the result? Well, the combined result of the shortfall in funding resulted in reduced healthcare facilities, less personnel, doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, you name it, less services, fewer MRIs and CAT scans, longer waiting lists, which are the natural outcome. And then with these developments, the argument that we need more private for-profit finance to meet this crisis began to really emerge onto the debate. But does the argument for private for-profit financing in the face even of this financial structure, does it stand up to scrutiny? Well, take a look at the data again. The percentage of health expenditures, the percentage of health money funded by you and myself, all of us, out of the public purse, in 1980, the percentage of public health was 75.5%, 75% of the total. In 2003, it's come down from 75 to 69.9%. What's happened on the private side? In 1980, the percentage was 24.5. But conversely to the public, it's now ballooned up to in excess of 30.1% in 2003. The cost drivers, of course, being outside of the core. Drugs now are the second most expensive call on the healthcare system, right behind hospitals. Doctors are third. But the most salient fact of this is that private healthcare expenditures grew during this period at a rate over double the rate of public expenditures, particularly in the 1990s. And still on the cost issue of the public side of Medicare, let me say this. The per capita, per person, provincial healthcare spending on hospitals, these figures, by the way, are not Roy Romanow pulled out of the air, but CIHI figures. The per capita provincial healthcare spending on hospitals has leveled off for persons 65 years of age and over. You know the aging argument. Leveled off. And is projected by CIHI and the Conference Board to decline sharply to the year 2020. For persons under age 65, the projections call for a flatlining to 2020. With doctors, CIHI estimates a flat line right straight through to 2020. Now, it just so happens that these expenditures, doctors and hospitals, are within the CHA core, what we call Medicare. So they're not obviously driving the costs up. So if the publicly funded system isn't driving the cost up, why are they going up? Well, I've already identified the dramatic increase in the private portion compared to the public. CIHI predicts, by the way, a continuing steep increase in per capita expenditures for home care and drugs. We're in and out of hospital more quickly, we're into home care. And drugs, it's the age of biology. Modern technologies like MRIs, CAT scans are going to further add to this cost, and it's going to continue to do so into the future. And that's where the costs have increased. So why is it that the public costs less than the private, based on the evidence? Well, there is one principal reason, and that is this. Those who decry the so-called monopoly, as they would describe it, of the single-payer universal core system that I've described, ignore this simple fact. Single-payer insurance systems like we have under the CHA have significantly lower administrative and overhead costs, and I don't say significantly, I should say dramatically lower administrative and overhead costs than other comparable systems. More than a decade ago, Harvard University professors Woolhandler and Himmelstein estimated that Canadians spent 2/3 less than Americans, 2/3 less on healthcare paperwork or administration and overhead. I'm not talking about hands-on delivery, but administration and paperwork. And then they revisited their study, and more recently they confirmed their findings in an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine, 2003. In this article, they said that the United States healthcare system, just the paperwork, cost Americans $294 billion. That's billion in 1999. In the United States, just the paperwork, this is Harvard, the United States spent $10.59 US per capita on healthcare, on paperwork, whereas in Canada, we only spent $307 US per capita on the same paperwork. In other words, the United States spends 3 times more just on administration and paperwork. And lest you think the bureaucracy is so efficient there, the paper says, quote, the bureaucracy accounted for 31%. The bureaucracy of total U.S. health spending in 1999 versus just slightly over 16% in Canada, end quote. Why? Well, as you read the studies, the answers are simple. Private schemes spend a lot of money on extensive infrastructure. In order to have competition, you need to have excess capacity. You have to choose, as amongst doctors or nurses or hospitals. There are all kinds of specialized hospitals which are set up. Then there's a question for insurance companies, multiple insurance companies. You have to assess the risk. You have to set the premium. You've got to design the benefit package. By the way, 45 million Americans have no insurance. 45 million have a benefits package which is underinsured for their needs. You have to review the claims, reimburse the beneficiaries, let alone mention the lawyers and the litigation which goes on. By contrast, the single-payer course universal system that I've talked about is spared almost all of these administrative outlays and difficulties associated with them. In fact, Himmelstein and Woolhandler and the subsequent studies say that if America adopted a Canadian model of the medically necessary core services, the money saved, that $294 billion, would be enough to put every American into an insurance program rather than leaving 50 million uninsured. And to top it off, a major side swipe of private for-profit health care is mounting individual bankruptcies, individual and corporate bankruptcies. In a study of 2004, December, called Illness and Injury as Contributors to Bankruptcy, Woolhandler and Himmelstein point out that, quote, the following, note this, in 2001, 1.5 million American families filed for bankruptcy. Half of those debtors, many of whom had private insurance that simply ran out or was inadequate, half of those cited medical causes for their bankruptcies, end quote. And then the authors conclude that there's a solution. The low rate of medical bankruptcy, as contrasted in Canada, suggests that better medical and social insurance, if adopted in America, would ameliorate this problem in the United States. But let's go back to total costs, just to make this point one more time. Historically, on total costs, throughout the 1950s and well into the 1960s, before we had Medicare, health spending as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product, that's total cost. Total healthcare spending in Canada and in the United States was and grew in lockstep. But when we introduced Medicare in Canada, spending in both countries grew, but dramatically at different paces. We devote just under 10% of all of our healthcare costs of the GDP. In the United States, the equivalent figure is over 15%. The total cost, private or public. And then add one final irony. When one totals the costs of Medicare in America, that's for the elderly, Medicaid, that's for the poor, government funding there, and tax breaks to insurance companies and other people to buy private insurance, then what did the researchers find and the evidence find? In reality, 60% of all healthcare spending in America is hidden, but it is publicly funded, in subsidies or otherwise. 60%. Now keep in mind Canada's comparable figure of 70. Keep in mind OECD is 80% public and 20 private. Those who say France has got a better system, it may or may not, is 80% 20, public-private. We're at 70, down from 80. But still our system provides fundamentally and basically necessary services, coverage, provides health outcomes that are on the whole at least comparable to, and more often than not better than those produced elsewhere. And based on all of this, none of which has been yet rebutted that I have seen in any peer-reviewed journal, one readily sees why we need to maintain the principles of Medicare and the system of Medicare. But if we do so, as my report stressed, if we have new money, that money must buy change to reflect today's realities. What kind of changes? Well, if the core system is efficient, bring in home care to the core, to join hospitals and doctors. Bring in drugs, maybe not all of them, but catastrophic. Bring in the advanced diagnostics like MRIs, which we have not brought in, and therefore you have a bunch of MRIs in Quebec and in Alberta and some in Ontario, and Premier McGuinty is making an effort to purchase them back. In this, clarify this. Attention should be paid to primary health care. Maybe bring it into the core. IT, information technology, modernize it through electronic telehealth. Pay special attention to rural needs, remote needs, to family doctors, and Aboriginal people, all of which is in my report. I'll spare you the details of them. But those are the kinds of changes which are required based on the evidence that it's more efficient and the outcomes are better in the comparison of the two systems. So how are we making out? It's now almost 3 years since I've tabled the report. Well, last September, the First Ministers met in Ottawa to fix health care for a generation, to quote the Prime Minister. On the positive side, I was there, by the way. I was there as a commentator with Peter Mansbridge. And so the Toronto Star had a cartoon, Mansbridge and I sitting side by side. It was called Medicare Night in Canada. And the caption was, "Okay, Roy, what do you have to say about this from your coach's corner?" Well, how prophetic it was at the time, right? But I was there. So let's just take a quick assessment of how we're doing. Last September, it was going to be a fix for a generation. On the positive side, I want to credit the federal government. Money is no longer an excuse for reforms to health care by the provinces. The federal government, which cut back in the CHST of 1995 that I talked to you about, is now back in its historic 50-50 relationship, and it is back as a full partner, at least from a monetary perspective. And in that regard, it aids Medicare as a national program. As well, there was a good deal of informed discussion amongst the First Ministers regarding the determinants of health, the social determinants of health. I'm going to say a special word about this in the light of John Sweeney, because this attaches and relates to him, but generally. You know, it's obvious to say this. A healthcare system, even the best one in the world, will only be one of the ingredients to determine whether your life, my life, will be long or short, healthy or sick, full of fulfillment, or empty with despair. If we want Canadians to be the healthiest people in the world, a goal that I set in the report, then we've got to connect all the dots that will take us there. And to connect the dots, we have to know where they are and what they are. And the social determinants, as the experts call them, are things like income, biggest indicator to your health well-being, early childhood development and care, housing, clean air in the environment, and water, to name some of them. These will shape your health and lifespan and are the ones that affect society as a whole. In fact, it has been reported that between the ages of 0 to 6, from birth to 6, it's pretty well all fixed. These determinants are there. And if we want Canadians to be the healthiest people in the world, we have to deal with these as a society as well. I'm sure that John Sweeney, this is something that he, as Minister of Community and Social Services, fully understood with his groundbreaking reforms to make it easier for people to move off welfare. When he released the Transitions Report, to help the most vulnerable move, in his words, from exclusion on the margins of society to integration within the mainstream of community life, because, he wrote, government recognizes that poverty is correlated with poor health and lower educational achievements, end quote. How right he was. His reforms aimed, quote, to help eliminate the stigmatization of merely being poor, end quote. He knew that the right thing to do was to lend them dignity and to ensure that they had a chance to share some of the great prosperity that exists in this great land of ours called Canada. And so we've got to start paying more attention to the social determinants, the upstream as opposed to the downstream acute care. And the First Ministers had a good discussion. Now it's time for action, but that's a good sign. There was also some advancement on the Aboriginal health front. But friends, I have to tell you here that the poor health outcomes for Aboriginal people remain a blight on this nation. In every category, our Aboriginal neighbors, First Nations, people who are here first, in every category of health, they are significantly poorer than we are. It's simply not tolerable in a compassionate and rich country as ours that this situation should prevail. But there's some progress. There was also some progress on benchmarks for reform. You've got to define what you want to achieve. I've identified home care and primary, etc. And you have to have accountability and indicators to report back to you and to me. We pay for the system as to how we're doing. Now, key to this is the Health Council of Canada. My idea was, built on the covenant, that the Health Council would then monitor independently how we were doing, and we would get away from this interminably, maddeningly, in my judgment, in any event, ongoing debate about provinces and the federal government, the intergovernmental warfare. And I throw no stones here. I certainly did my more than fair share of throwing the bricks in the mortar at the time. But we had a health council, we thought, which would be effective and well-funded and report to Canadians and see whether those benchmarks are being made. But at the First Minister's meeting, the process for reporting was confusing. Wait lists to CIHI, some performance to Health Council. At the end of the day, each provincial jurisdiction, the argument was, this would be left up to the voters to decide how you're making out. I think this is a failing. Keep in mind that Medicare is supposed to be a shared responsibility between two orders of government acting in the national interest and based on Canadian values. There is a need for stronger consequences for non-compliance or poor progress by any province that doesn't do the job, especially after they signed that First Minister's Accord in 2004. It's not simply that the voters will decide. And then there is, in assessing the question of how we're doing, the provision so-called asymmetrical federalism. Have you heard about that phrase? Asymmetrical federalism? Well, in my judgment, this should be a source of ongoing attention, if not concern. They signed the Health Accord and they permitted Quebec to sign its own separate deal. Other similar provinces have a similar right. I was interviewed by a reporter from the Montreal Gazette 2 days ago, and he said, how come we have so many MRIs, private for profit, in Montreal? There's an explosion of private for profit. And I said, well, because we neglected them in the 1990s and they're outside of the CHA core. And he said, well, can we bring them back in the CHA core? Yes, we can if we refocus and redirection and the CHA provides power. And then I said, but maybe it doesn't provide power because we have, in effect, transferred that to Quebec in the asymmetrical deal. And the question that's got to be asked, this is a nation-building issue, by the way, but that's a topic for another day. The question on health care that has to be asked is this: will those who argue that Medicare is not sustainable use this asymmetrical provision in other provinces to expand private for-profit delivery and payment and thereby further erode our Canadian national program? We know that Alberta is going to have a special conference in May on this topic, which brings me to this question of sustainability and this whole private for-profit debate. Clearly there were shortfalls. Clearly we haven't reformed the system, and there's frustration. But we have to expand the system. I've argued that. I won't repeat the arguments. Really a replenishment with change of the old cuts. But when I advance that view, people say, oh, well, you're thinking in the box. It's not sustainable, notwithstanding all the evidence I just gave about the private-public arrangements. Well, what is sustainable? Sustainable is defined as follows, quote, ensuring sufficient resources, note the word resources, cash, yes, but resources. Sufficient resources are available over the long term to provide timely access to quality services that address our evolving health needs, end quote. Now, there are three components to that definition: resources, services, evolving needs. I use the word resources deliberately because this cash is important, no doubt about it. A properly functioning health delivery system also depends upon the right type of mixture of the program of deliveries, from buildings to equipment to IT. Primary health care is an excellent example of reorganizing or organizing our resources to provide a better continuum of care and to work on preventive medicine. Now, determining how to apply available resources to evolving needs and to tie that to the services is a very big challenge. I admit that. You have to juggle needs, services, and resources. Needs are evolving. We know that. Maybe too much expectation, as the Vatican indicated, but they're there. Services are evolving. Age of biology, more technology. Financing is variable. And frankly speaking, our delivery mechanisms are burdened by history, habit, and general inertia. We're in silos. Doctors are here, nurses are there, administrators are there, provincial governments are there, and on it goes. And there are also competing calls on a provincial government to use money other than healthcare into education, as you had the post-secondary report. So it's a tough job. It's a constant contest of how you balance these competing issues to make it sustainable. Now, friends, I want to be very blunt here, if I may, or more blunt. There are fundamentally only two competing approaches, visions, as to how to best determine this balance. Neither is perfect. One vision is based on the premise that healthcare is a commodity. You buy and sell it like a car or a house or furniture or whatever. And if you accept this view, healthcare and the balance will ebb and flow with the markets. The marketplace will determine the balance. And there's lots of evidence as to where the market does that. That's the private for-profit side. The other vision is based on the notion that healthcare is a moral enterprise or a public good, leaving to democratically elected governments the difficult task, sometimes imperfectly performed, of balancing resources, services, and needs, and in a transparent fashion, thus the Health Council. And the balancing act is ultimately determined and legitimated or rejected by us through democratic will. Now, proponents for more private for-profit delivery, the commodity approach, they immediately profess they support the CHA. They immediately say they reject the U.S. model. In fact, they say, Romanow, don't compare us to America, compare us to some third way. They say study other schemes in other provinces, in other countries. Well, we've done that. Others have done that. But then they go on to say that in order to improve the system, we need, and here are the key words, exact quotations. They then go on to say we need to have competition and choice, in quotation marks. And friends, competition and choice is in direct contradiction to the Canada Health Act and the concept of community and universal delivery that I've talked about. It is a complete and utter contradiction of not only the CHA, but our values, if I'm right, that they still exist today, as I believe I am. And when they argue more competition and choice, regrettably, no evidence is submitted of the cost efficiencies or the improved health outcomes. So therefore, we're asked merely to rely on beliefs or hopes or ideas and hope that somehow, somewhere, someday, this might provide a better answer, to trade in the known for the unknown. Well, friends, I've challenged those who support the marketplace commodity idea to bring forward the evidence, not the ideology or the wishful thinking, and to demonstrate that it has now become, as well, a fundamental value underpinning our society and Medicare. I do so again tonight. So far, as they say, the silence has been deafening. And surprisingly, this approach is portrayed as something new. I'm in the box, they're out of the box. I couldn't figure this out. If I'm in a box, it's because Canadians have told me this is where they prefer to go. But if somebody's advocating private for profit, they're in a box, ideologically and presumably backed up by some evidence. But anyway, they say it's new thinking, it's innovative thinking. How innovative? Let me read you this quote. Quote, what is meant by universal, this is referring to Medicare, what is meant by universal is that the plan arbitrarily includes everybody, whether they need the benefits and whether they wish to be included or not. It is a compulsory program in which participation is compelled by the state and not left to the voluntary choice of the citizen themselves. This violates a fundamental principle of a free society, namely the right of each citizen to exercise choice or competition, end quote. Who said this and when? This quote came at the height of the debate on Emmett Hall's report in 1964 that we adopt Medicare following the Saskatchewan model. It was made in 1965, 1 year after the report was tabled, by a very distinguished Canadian, the former late Alberta Premier Ernest Manning in 1965. Choice, competition, compulsory, arbitrary. And now the argument is back. Suddenly the old has become the new. Well, I say, ask the parents or the guardians of the millions of American children who are not covered by health insurance how they're enjoying their exercise of freedom of choice. That is what I say. For sure, we have major problems of wait times in the country, but it defies logic to suggest that the only possible solution is to allow more doctors to opt out of the system or to allow people to buy their way to the front of the line. How exactly does reducing the number of doctors practicing publicly or letting those with money get faster access to care help reduce the wait times for everyone else? Or, as the Vatican talked about in other terms, for the population outcomes of a community at large. So, friends, in closing, as I look at the history and my experiences I've tried to relate to you, not by way of any braggadocio, but just to give you an example that I've had some experience and exposure to Canadians' views. In closing, I say this. We are now at a serious crossroads with respect to the future of Medicare as we know it. Well, as we know it and as it should be reformed. The reforms are clearly set out. They may vary in some of the reports, but the directions are there. Home care, primary care, you name them. But they're being very slowly, if at all, implemented. And the debate on private for-profit Medicare is now increasing. Up to now, it's been largely in the shadows. I know, I was there when the first ministers would meet and the debate would be about private for-profit care. The only way it would finally come to an end is if one of the first ministers would challenge the proponent of private for-profit care to say to him, go downstairs and tell the 150 journalists who are waiting that you're for private for-profit care, because the moment you're finished, I'm right down behind you to tell you what I believe about values and public system care. And of course, that shuts up the debate. But privatization takes place by stealth. And now it's not even by stealth. But it must emerge from the shadows, this debate. And I raise it to you tonight because it must emerge from the shadows and must be publicly thought about, and the debate must be undertaken so that Canadians who own the Medicare system have their say. And if they still believe in the values and they believe in a reform system, so they can say to all of those premiers and others who would want to undo our value and our value system, hold on, not so fast, not before I've got something to say about this. When it comes to something as fundamental as health care, principles and values come first. Principles and values come first. System architecture and design second. They can vary and they can be different, but values come first. In fact, to be more specific, I'm going to quote Judith Maxwell of the Canadian Policy Research Network in Ottawa, CPRN, who put it this way, examining the work of our commission. She said, quote, the legitimacy, and it's partly the quote that you used, Dr. Seljak, the legitimacy and sustainability of any major policy decision increasingly depends on how well it reflects the underlying values of the public, end quote. You can't make, in the year 2005, if you ever could, good social policy without understanding what the foundations of the values are. And sustainability in this regard is more than just money. It's about ensuring a continuum of care, but it's also about our society and values. Sustainability is about that too, more than money. It's having the requisite support of the majority of citizens subscribing to those values. This includes sharing the values that I've described that underpin our system. From this perspective, I conclude this. Medicare is today as sustainable as our society and our values wills it to be. Depends on you. And I think that the good news is that Canadians today continue to support the vision of a caring and compassionate society of which Medicare is a reflection, and therefore it will be sustainable because of that belief. And government programs that promote the public good require that we stand up and look after each other, because as a community we can accomplish so much more sometimes than we could ever dream of doing as individuals. John Sweeney understood this. He lived his life with this in mind. John Sweeney was the change he sought in the world. And in this regard, and in that spirit, it has been a distinct honor and privilege, humbling one for me, to join with you tonight to celebrate this remarkable man, his remarkable legacy, with you and in the context of a remarkable program, Canadian program called Medicare. To all of you, thank you, good luck, and God bless.
Thank you so much. Mr. Romanow has generously agreed to answer some questions. If you have a question, please put your hand up. Ivan Person at the back will give you a microphone so that we can all hear it.
Now, I have a rule. If it's a tough question, David will answer it, and I'll take all these. Who wants to ask?
Hello, my name is Minnie McGuire.
Can you just give me a wave of the hand? See where yes.
I have a question. I'm a member of the Ontario Health Coalition, so I'm sure you're very familiar with us. We supported the Romanow Commission, gathered thousands of signatures to promote your work, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for you, knowing that you have a legal background. The number of services formerly done in hospitals that have been moved out to home care are at risk. It's in my opinion that the Canada Health Act covers the service, not the building. And yet when the service moves out to the home, extra expenses are incurred by our patients. Can you speak to that? Is there any way that we can develop a legal argument to provide or to bring these services formerly done in hospitals, now done in the home, under the Canada Health Act?
This is a very important question, and to answer it very briefly, I believe that your interpretation carries much weight to it, that it could very well be a legal principle, as you've described, that the services count. If they're transferred from hospital to home care, they're still covered. However, it is unclear that that proposition would hold up in any legal challenge that might take place. In my judgment, and thus the recommendation that I made, the easiest, quickest way to do this would be to bring it into the Canada Health Act, complementing hospitals and doctors. In the first instance, just a platform of care. I've been criticized, and I think legitimately so, that it didn't expand into long-term care and nursing home care and the like. But I wanted at least to have some form of coverage for that period when we're out of hospital, the shift of services from hospital to home care, someone looking after us who's knowledgeable and able. That's where you heal better. Hospitals are very dangerous places to be. I say that with all the best work of all the tremendous professionals. You heal better at home. You can have all kinds of care, spiritual care in addition to professional care. I think the easy answer is to have a platform built right into the CHA to eliminate any doubt. Courts are very good. They're honest men and women who apply their best intelligence and legal principles to a decision. I think this is a decision which belongs with us, the public, the people. And to do that would be a simple amendment to the Canada Health Act defining a set of home care programs and goals and objectives. So your argument has merit. I think there's no doubt about it, but I just think it's too dangerous to undertake.
Okay. My question is about provincial health care and how right now the Ontario government being faced with such a large deficit and trying to, it seems, moving a lot of services into the community with family health teams, long-term care homes, stuff, and a lot of stuff like you talked about, bringing the MRIs, like you said, back into the public sector. That takes a lot of money, and with the limited resources that a government with such a large deficit has, it elicits a lot of criticism, I think, from the public, and a lot of fear that, you know, through this change period that you sort of talked about, you know, you need to change to make the system better sometimes, but how do you get through that period of fear from the public over moving services, which in the end, because of financial considerations, are going to mean cuts to other areas, such as, you know, taking nurses out of hospitals but putting them into a family health team, or the shifting of resources. How does a government make those kind of changes without the outcry from the public, and how do you get through that in order to maybe create a totally different looking system in the end that would be better?
Well, the answer, in my judgment, is that if the reforms are properly thought out and are detailed, and there's determination to implement them because there'll be a better change, there's only one answer to your question as to how you do it. You have to do it. And let me say that in Saskatchewan, I'm not very proud of saying this necessarily, but I was Premier when we shut down 52 hospitals, converted them to wellness models and units. And there were thousands of people in protests as I traveled around trying to explain why we did this. It wasn't a question of cost saving. It was cost saving, but it cost as much to develop more of a preventative primary health care system. I think it's quite understandable that if people are, well, like I am, we fear the unknown more than we do the known. So better the devil you know than the devil you don't. What has to be undertaken is change, and if they're properly thought out, the changes, they then become quickly accepted. May I say, finally, in answer to your question, historically, this is exactly what happened in Saskatchewan with Douglas. Douglas got elected in 1960 saying, elect me and I'll give you Medicare in Saskatchewan alone. He introduced the legislation. The doctors went out on strike. Every one of them, maybe with the exception of 3 or 4. There were rallies. I was there as a young student. You had no choice. You had to pick one side or the other in that debate. rallies of 10, 15,000 people in Saskatchewan demanding not to go into health care because they believed that it was the end of what they felt was a pretty good system. It's the unknown. There comes a point in public policy where if you believe what you're doing is right, must be done effectively and efficiently in order to subside the fears, continuing to waffle and indecision and lack of clarity. I'm not saying this about this government, but any government, from my experience, is a prescription for sure of never getting the reforms done. So, do it. And if the result is you get defeated, sometimes it's better to be defeated for the right reasons than to win for the wrong reasons.
In the category of medically necessary services, I don't know whether you want to touch or comment on this quite hot topic, but do you consider that governments paying for abortions are medically necessary?
Well, the answer is that in every jurisdiction, this dodges the question a little bit, but I think it's a sufficient answer. The reality is that in every jurisdiction, this is exactly what's being done, because the belief is that it is a medical condition. There are requirements. Some may argue they're too lax and consent's required before the procedure is undertaken. I know the moral and ethical issues. Please, I don't mean to throw this out as any buy of sympathy on this very tough question, but I'm of Catholic background, and I think I understand the arguments there. But the reality is, for example, it used to be that in the province of Quebec, the highest rate of abortions per thousand was in the province of Quebec. Largest Catholic-based population in the country. And still is. Yes, and still is. So it's a question of whether or not we are going to view this as a medically necessary service for a person with all the checks and balances which are into place. And I think that the right decision from that perspective was made. On the ethical and moral issue, that's a question of ongoing debate, I suppose. Who's next?
There's some gentleman in the back.
I'm not begging for questions. You know, but,
The microphone is moving around slowly.
Mr. Romanow, you actually said the biggest offender in breaking the Canada Health Act are the provinces. Now, you know, over the last 10 years, the federal government have actually underfunded and not paid their share of what they're supposed to do on the Canada Health Act. On the Canada Health Act, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they have been supposed to be paying 50 cents out of every dollar of healthcare spent.
That's right.
In the last 10 years, they've paid 8 of that, which is 16%. Now, what mechanism, is there any mechanism you would actually recommend that they would have to pay their share of this? Or, you know, I can see healthcare being sustained if the money being collected is being used for healthcare, but it certainly has not been over the last 10 years.
That is correct. Again, without rehashing my report, the recommendation I had was first, restore federal cash transfers to their traditional level, roughly 50-50. That has now been done. Secondly, give that sum for 5 years certain, so the hospitals and the provincial governments know what's coming, with an escalator clause built in. At the end of the 5 years, have the escalator clause and the capacity of the administration in Ottawa to be able to continue this kind of transfer examined. The escalator may be too high, it may be too low, there may be other circumstances which will adjust it. But it would provide certainty for the deliverers at the hospital level and every level that the sums would be there. Keep in mind that this is a replenishment of funds, but it is also a reform of the program using the new funds as kind of the carrot and stick approach to do so. So if your question stated another way is, what moral authority does Ottawa have to enforce the Canada Health Act when it cut back so drastically? That's a tough one. I argued strenuously as Premier that they had little moral authority to do so. I'm prepared to overlook that for the moment. What I'm saying is that after September 2004, the money is there and the goals, even fuzzy as they are set out. Now there's no excuse. For me, I don't want to pick on my friend Ralph Klein. I don't. I've worked with him for 8-9 years, and I think I've had my disagreements with him, goodness knows, or he's had his disagreements with me. But I do not understand how it is that 10 premiers, 3 territorial leaders, and the Prime Minister, late at night, Wednesday night, signed an accord for the money for 10 years with the reforms, and then 7 months later are going to establish a conference in May in Alberta talking about private for-profit delivery.
You know, we have said when they started this, on the Canada Health Act, to be giving 50 cents out of every dollar. They never did. Not only that, but they did not enforce universality. There are certain areas that have private funding, and they're all federal. The military and the mountains both have private funding. They have Blue Cross funding. By coverage, the federal politicians go to a military hospital.
You're right, sir. There are exceptions. For example, workers' compensation boards are able to bypass the public system. I recommended against that. It should be within the public system, as I did with respect to the federal organizations as well. But those are relatively minor exceptions in the scheme of things. When you're looking at the overall concepts of payment and delivery based on, if you accept my thesis, the proposition that I advocated tonight, well, I totally agree with you, but I argue that level weakened around 1990, leaving the exceptions aside, and dipped very dramatically. And here I totally agree with you. But I'm also saying that it's now being replenished. Question is it being replenished to buy the change? Is it being monitored? I don't want to make my speech over again. And is it enforceable as it should be? That's my slight difference from your view.
There's a question back there.
Yeah. And one here, too.
Hi there. I'm wondering what
Hi
it
there.
is that you think that citizens can do in order to make their wishes known to the government about things like including services in the Canadian Health Act, to include things like home care and things like that in the Canadian Health Act.
Well, this is a very simplistic answer, it may seem, but to me, and I have to say this because I devoted my life to public policy and politics, you got to get into the arena. Doesn't mean you have to run, but you have to be active as a citizen in democratic decisions taken by the processes of government. And that means speaking to MPs and cornering MPPs and writing letters and getting involved with the Ecumenical Council if they should be involved, or others who should be involved, to advance the cause. Because for sure, the other side is being heard and their cause is being advanced, and very often the public will react to that. I think the big break on the government's reacting fully on the other side is the fact that in overwhelming numbers, even on the latest polling, I think it's around 70 to 80% still support the principles of and the values behind the Canada Health Act. And that's the holdback. But the debate continues, as we see in Alberta. So what can you do? Is the only thing that I can do. Make speeches wherever I can. You make speeches and participate. To not do so is tantamount to being, sorry to use hockey as an analogy, to being a spectator in the rink rather than being a player on the ice. Got to take your knocks and your blows in a small little way even. Citizen action.
Hi, my question is simply, are the total healthcare costs increasing overall? And if yes, how do we finance it, taking into consideration the senior population will increase in the following years? Thank you.
Well, again, without making my speech over again, the financing numbers are I think, quite clear. Let me give you this answer from a different perspective. The Department of Finance Canada has an internal report which was released to the Globe and Mail in January, carried out by their finance economists and analysts in January of 2004. It takes a look at all of the cost drivers, aging, drugs, and so forth. It takes a look at what can be done to account for them and concludes that if we make reforms, not identical to the ones that I recommend, but similar to those reforms, it is absolutely sustainable for the next 40 years based on the projected growth of the economy. If I had a blackboard, I could demonstrate this to you, but I won't. I'll just simply, if you can imagine a chart that goes like this and like this, and this start point is 1971, when 50-50 was introduced, and they mapped it out to the year 2020 as to what the costs would be as against actual projected growth. No one knows whether their projected growth becomes a reality. It matched the actual spending, the projections, with just a few changes until 1990, and all of a sudden there was a huge gap for a decade, which I tried to describe in my address. Thus the shortage. So we didn't get into this jackpot overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. As for the aging issue, keep in mind what I indicated to you about the hospitalization of 65 and over. It's flatlined and utilization is going to decrease. But there are other studies on aging. Our people are aging, but they're aging healthier. They're more productive to the community and society. Thank goodness that they are. It is true, as aging leads eventually to illness and to death, there'll be a cost factor there, but it won't be as it used to be, a longer period of hospitalization or care. That's one study by the CIHR and the Institutes on Aging. Another study comes from the IRPP. They argue that even if there is aging, the savings accounts, which people who are in the retirement age and therefore more likely to be ill, are rather significant, and they will be able to supplant, because once you draw your RRSP down, any of the charges on the purse at that stage in the game. Now, this gets too technical, but my point is, at the end of the day, every time somebody has said historically for 30 years or more, but what about the MRIs, can we afford them, or what about the aging, or what about that? The answer is we've been able to afford them through reforms, and we can do the same here. The one thing we may not be able to do, which is the real big challenge of the Vatican, is how do you control those expectations? How do we get into, I hope I don't offend anybody here, the Botoxes and all of the other, forever youthful and young medical procedures, or I need my knee replaced right away. I know that's important. You'll get it replaced if it's medically necessary and urgent at the time. It's the expectations, I think, is the biggest cost driver, and that, I think, is a question that also speaks to values. And the Vatican, I think, generated a very important debate today. So the evidence is there that it's sustainable.
Halfway up.
David, I've got my hand up here, and I've had it up for quite a while. You know, you've been ignoring it.
Do you believe that there are structural changes to governance in Canada that will better enable us to deal with more long-term issues like healthcare, like education? Perhaps one example might be a stronger role for the Senate, allowing us to have a body that deals with long-term issues better than our currently dealt with.
Structural changes are needed, but not the Senate. It is not representative of the population in terms of just numbers and so forth, but it does not have the legitimacy of popular election. Now, you can argue what happens if we elect them. That's a whole new argument. We've tried that debate, and it hasn't gotten off anywhere. By the way, in order to change the way Senate is composed, you have to have the approval of the Senate to the constitutional change. So I don't know. If I was sitting there as a senator drawing down whatever I'm doing, I don't think I'd vote myself out of a job to have to go back to fight another election. I've had too many elections, as the scars on my back will attest. So I think the reforms are elsewhere. In my judgment, the reforms are in things like health council, covenants, pressure of public, responsible political leadership, which has a vision of Canada, and this as a nation-building concept of Canada.
We have many, many hands but we are running out of time, and Mr. Romanow is fighting a cold, and so he's maybe running out of voice. So let's just have a few, but please keep them brief and to the point. And
David, what about here to the left?
we'll catch you next in time. Everyone in turn.
Yes.
Romanow, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the argument that Canada's commitments to services liberalization, both at the World Trade Organization and within NAFTA, may at some point in the future restrict our autonomy or restrict our ability to reform the system, perhaps even to maintain the health component of the system?
Bang on. I think that fear is legitimate. And again, in the interest of time, I'll simply say to you, if you're having trouble sleeping at night, Chapter 10 or 11 of this 350-page report deals exclusively with globalization and health. It hangs on a very narrow phrase. If there is a social policy in the public interest, that's the WTO phrase, then Medicare, our kinds of programs, are exempted. You change that phrase, and we're out. So as a small country, we have to, as we did at Doha, I think to the credit of the federal government, partner with other small countries who have their own social systems and values in order to make sure that little precious reed isn't broken. It's much more complicated than that, but we spoke to it in the report, something, again, which hasn't received any kind of attention. But I think it poses a very, very important issue for ongoing consideration right now, without a doubt. Now, I hope you're not so angry that it's going to be a tough question that I can't handle. So,
I guess one of my problems is I often do give tasks a tough. Maybe that times ignored. In any event, the key word here is values. Of course, we talked, and it helps to distinguish the topic. Values something that means very, very much to me. As a citizen amateur, I helped to catalyze the establishment of the University Center for Society, Technology and Values here, which was set up about 15 or so years ago. And now, values, in a sense, are close to you besides this talk, in that Bob McMurtry's brother John wrote a book called Value Wars. There's a value wars are taking place at this point in time, and they're the two sides that sort of battling. And I think the introduction of Fox TV into Canada introduces a different element to this. We get our good values primarily from our educational institutions, the family, and so on. But there's commercial interests out there.
Totally agree.
That have control of the media to a very large extent, with exception to a large degree of the CBC. And they're busy trying to inculcate values that are to the disadvantage of life on the planet. Somehow there has to be more focus on values. How can that be brought about? Almost we need a discipline at universities called values. We need a decision. It's so important that every decision we make. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can move things towards values being more significant in I was just asking the question.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, this is again only in the interest of time because it's such a complex and important question. But I honestly have to say, to me, you've put your finger on it when you talk about the educational system and universities and schools and home. Well, church. There's a combination of things which are under some form of threat or erosion, perhaps, where the values need to be integrated throughout the whole piece, and we're not doing that, and not enough attention is being paid. But I'd add one little positive note to this. You will have no doubt read, but for those of you who haven't, I highly recommend it, and I get no fee for doing this, a book by Michael Adams called Fire and Ice. Fire and Ice. It won last year's 2004 Donner Book Prize for Policy Book of the Year in Canada. And Adams was a pollster for Environics for 20 years, and using the data on the external influences occasioned by free trade and globalization, he wanted to know whether the values had changed. And I think I'm quoting him roughly accurately. He said that in two areas, if anything, somewhat contrary to popular belief, two values have strengthened in Canada over time, notwithstanding this importation of what may be called a foreign set of values in Canada. One, social programs, the whole plethora of social programs, but he stressed Medicare. And two, on the international field, multilateralism as opposed to unilateralism with respect to the resolution of the world's conflicts. Those are stronger today than they've ever been based on his polling. So his argument is that sometimes it is possible, these are my words as I read his book, it is sometimes seems like it is possible that Canadians, being who we are, that we have built a society where there are individual interests, obviously, but we've balanced it with communitarian responses, as in contrast to Americans. I don't want to single them out, where the society is very individualistic, the United States Bill of Rights and the like. We've been able to temper this, and we've had to fight to distance and small populations. We've had to work together. In some ways, in the face of all of this globalization, the second last question, his argument is that there has been a strengthening of this value. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I have to accept his work on it. But what is important to your question is it can't rest there. And how to deal with it, I think you've put your finger on, is about as good an answer as I could think of.
And we have one last question.
Hello, Mr. Romanow. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you. You're kind.
This question is prompted by your comment related to citizen action and the importance of citizens being active participants in the democratic process. And I'm a young Canadian, and I'm an active participant in the political process, but I'm reminded continuously whenever an election is held that I'm also a part of the most apathetic sector of the population. And I was wondering, throughout the course of your consultations, if you heard from any young Canadians and their vision for the future, since we are going to be future policymakers, decision makers, voters, governors, and so on.
The answer, shortly and concisely, is yes. Much. Many times during the course of the hearings. And even sometimes when I'm no longer commissioner outside the hearings. I got a full hour and a half today from 3 young women students from St. Jerome's. And I say this very, very admiringly. But let me give you one example coming back to the hearings. There are many examples, but this will be an example which is typical. I'm holding a submission, I think it was in St. John's, Newfoundland, and it happened to me actually in Toronto. And here we had these formal submissions. 4, 5 doctors studying their specialties in internship, in residency, from Toronto. And they say, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Romanow, we want to ask permission to do something here before we make a written submission. I thought, oh my goodness, it's all being televised. And I said, sure, go ahead, not knowing what it was. And out comes a great big banner that they put out over top of the presentation table. And what does the banner say? New docs for Medicare. Turns out to be PARO, the Association of Interns and Residents of Ontario. And then in Toronto, the national 8,000 doctors involved. Now, I'm not saying all 8,000 support that, but there they are. Articulate, knowledgeable, understanding of the values, and want it protected and preserved. And this keeps on going over and over and over and over again. So I am extremely encouraged by the young voices that I hear. And I do not despair, as some do, about the apathy of young people. I think there's as much apathy, if not more, in those of us who are not quite as young as there is amongst the young people. And I saw it over and over and over again. It gives me a great deal of hope, and it was confirmed today in the very short ride that I had from Toronto to KW here. Is that it? Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Romanow was looking for the politically correct word that's the opposite of young, and it's now the chronologically gifted. To thank Mr. Romanow on behalf of everyone here, the hospital and St. Jerome's have asked Tim Sweeney to say a few words.
Hours and hours and hours of time have been spent to remind me to keep this short, so I will. Mr. Romanow, I'd like to say thank you very much. I wish you could have met my dad. He would very much enjoyed your talk, and you'd probably be having dinner at my mom and dad's house tonight if you were. I guess what I really wanted to say was a little over 20 years ago, Dad had his first heart attack, and our family owes the medical community 20 years of having our husband and father with us, and we very much appreciate that. And I'd like to thank everyone here who is actually directly with the medical community. We appreciate it. It's a cyclical thing. I think Dad gave a lot of his time to the hospital because the hospital gave a lot of time to him. So thank you very much.
Very, very nicely said, Tim. Thank you for that. I just want to say a few things before we break up tonight. One, there are envelopes, as Mr. Andre Anderson mentioned, donations for the St. Mary's General Hospital Foundation. That money is to go to support the Sweeney Lecture. Secondly, health seems to be the topic of the day. Due to some health concerns, our 2 March lectures have been cancelled. And those were 2 very excellent lectures, so we're quite disappointed. But both Douglas John Hall, who was to speak here on March 4th, and Hans Christoph Graf von Sponeck, the former director of the Food for Oil program in the United Nations for Iraq, have promised to come to St. Jerome's at their earliest possible time. So those are cancelled, but we'll call them postponed. The other thing I want to say is these kind of cancellations do happen, so we have an email list for all of our center events. We email just reminders, a little more biographical information of the speakers, and also when we have cancellations, at least you know, so that you don't have to show up. And Carol Person has a table at the back there. You can do that for her. Tonight's lecture was recorded. We do sell tapes and CDs of every lecture at the St. Jerome Center at cost, and that's also available in the back. As well as you probably noted a table there with Wordsworth books. Mr. Romanow mentioned a book, The Social Determinants of Health, or actually mentioned the topic, not the book, but that book is available. It has a foreword in it by Mr. Romanow, and that is at the... Sorry?
Alex McCarthy.
Yes, that's it, and it's available at the back there. Finally, there is a petition going around. There's 2, but the Ontario Healthcare Association has a petition with clipboards that they have been passing around. The Ecumenical Network of the Canadian Council of Churches on Healthcare also has a petition at the back for a health covenant campaign, it's called, and that is available here. It is also available at the back of the room. All of it remains then is for me to thank St. Mary's Hospital and the Hospital Foundation, especially the amount of work that was done behind the scenes for this event with Peter Sweeney. I want to thank Peter personally. Also like to thank the St. Joe's Healthcare System, which is a major donor to the endowment for the John Sweeney Lecture, and to thank once again Mr. Romanow for coming away from the dry cold of Saskatchewan to our own unique form of cold here in Ontario. And so all that remains then is to thank you all for your attention, for your support for the St. Jerome Centre, and have a good night. Thank you.